Welcome back. So for today's video, I didn't really have a plan. I just wanted to design something, wanted to paint something that I was gonna have a good time with. So rather than the entire design process, I actually didn't really bother because I started making this first sketch and I wasn't really feeling the way it was going. So I only ended up doing one other sketch and then immediately going into painting. It's not necessarily a design itself, it is more an illustration in the end. But you know, sometimes you just gotta go with what feels right, especially if it's for these sort of personal projects. You don't want to put too much pressure on the end result. So the only thing I really kept in mind was the fact that someone left a comment saying, I want to see a forest gnome. So that forest gnome was the main thing I used as a starting point, and then I basically just kind of used my associative thinking to start thinking about, okay, what can I do with this? So the thought process was, the forest gnome needs a function, needs a role, and in that role I decided to assign her as somewhat of a forest guardian that maybe is more of a protector of like the owl bears, hence the little owl bear family that you saw at the start. But also aside from that, the thing I wanted to keep in mind is maybe I'll sketch something that I don't usually sketch, which is first of all women characters, because that's just something that has always kind of been a pain point in my skill, and I've been practicing and I've been getting better at it, and I'm gonna keep practicing until I'm actually good at it, at least according to my own standards, right? Aside from that, you know, usually I also tend to default to like burly old men, grizzled old men that maybe have a bit of uncanny proportions. So I decided to go for something like quite the opposite of what I usually do, which is this little girl that protects like her owl bear family. And since I mainly wanted to focus on the personality of this girl, I wanted to play around with what I could do with turning some features into perhaps a bit more of a unique feature. Like the hairdo, for example, is pretty noticeable. I'm aware of this, and that's also very much on purpose. And the face itself kind of became a little bit uncanny, as sometimes it happens when I want to draw children. They tend to end up perhaps a bit more creepy than I intended. But at the same time, I do think she has a bit of a cute factor combined with someone you don't necessarily want to mess with, which was kind of what I was going for, since I wanted to turn this image into like she is the protector of this owlbear family, which is kind of a funny concept when you consider the maybe like, let's say 300 kilo owlbear behind her. But anyway, she's the best suited for the job. She will be able to protect the entire family, I'm sure of that. So I'm not questioning her authority at all. What you can notice maybe in the video already is, since I've taken more of a painting approach, like this is not a design I'm making, this is more of an illustration, I'm using a very different workflow than what I usually do. I tend to be much more loose when I want to consider it as an illustration, because that's a case, like since everything doesn't need to be visible, everything doesn't need to be clean, I'm mainly thinking about how I can use my shapes of light and dark to tie the painting together, as well as how I can keep things looking nice and organic and gestural. And in this case, rather than, for example, blocking out the colors very cleanly, I just wanted to put everything in the right place so I knew what the most rudimentary color associations would be, because as you might have heard, color is relative. A color only gets its meaning when you put a color next to it. So the colors next to the character were very important for me to know how to paint the character. So I needed to have at least a foundation of the environmental colors before I could move on to painting up the character itself. Once I have that foundation, I'm not worrying about having all the silhouettes filled in, because I'm actually quite happy with some of the warm underpainting shining through in specific areas, specifically in the areas where you have the highlights on the hair, for example, like that rim light on the side that's supposed to feel quite warm. So I don't want to paint away every single warm bit of the underpainting just quite yet. I want to see how much I can keep in up until the final pass I'm gonna assign to this painting. That's often a very tricky thing to do. Keeping an underpainting alive kind of forces you to not fully render something, and people tend to be a little bit perfectionist when it comes to their own art. When they look at someone else's painting, they might think, that's such a masterful thing, the way they left that underpainting in place, or the way they use so little brushstrokes. But I'm betting that when you get a painting to the same level of finish, you might not be satisfied, and you might think, well, I can actually just paint this up a little bit more, and then at some point you kind of lose the charm of the original painting. That's happened to me so often, where I take a painting just that one step too far, and I think to myself, dang, like an hour ago it was looking much nicer. So one of the core things to practice in that case is to learn when to stop and leave it be. Like in this case, for example, I've been rendering this character. At this point, I think like an hour has passed probably, and I have the face and the scarf and some of the shoulders, but I haven't really bothered with anything else, and I think that is an issue in my own workflow in this case. Again, I should have just kind of put the base building blocks in place, started moving through the rest of the painting, and making sure that everything is leveling up at the same time, rather than moving through it like a printer, like what I'm doing right now, painting up the face and moving your way down the character. I don't think that's a good approach, so I will be working on that myself to avoid that from happening in future paintings as well. And that's a continuous process. You know, like every time you discover things you might have approached better, things you might have approached worse, and that is why, you know, the whole study process is quite an important thing to keep in mind every so often. But in this case, I don't mind too much where it's going. Like, I'm quite happy with the way it's looking. I'm just kind of vibing with the process itself. So again, not putting too much pressure on myself on following a particular workflow. I'm just seeing where things go, and that is such a fun, liberating feeling as an artist when you actually are creating like an original piece. You should have those moments where you can just kind of vibe with your own painting, continue your work, and not worry about where it's headed per se, and not worry about what the right or wrong way to do it is. Like, there's just a way to do it, and if you bring it to a successful end result, the process really didn't matter all that much, at least when it's for personal work, right? Like when you're talking about professional work, then the process might be important to at least get right. Hence, for example, the difference between a concept piece workflow and a illustration workflow like this one. But I do enjoy the way this was looking. I have a lot of storytelling in place, hopefully, with the owlbears itself. I could have done a little bit more storytelling on the character, but I'm quite fond of the different materials in the outfit. The oversized belt, I think, really helps make her feel much smaller and younger, which is obviously the intent, because she's supposed to be a child, and not only a child, but a gnome child. So she's supposed to be small for a small species. So to get that right, I needed to play around with the proportions of not only the character, but also the outfit she's wearing. I could have probably leaned into that a little bit more with stuff like the boots, but you know, the oversized scarf along with the oversized belt that clearly is way too wide for her own like stature. The very large buns on the head as well, I think work very well with the proportions of the outfit. And aside from the proportions of the outfit, also the proportions of the elements of the face, for example. Big eyes, big forehead, big ears, usually good indication to youth in a character design. You really want to play around with the proportions of the elements on the face itself to make sure that someone looks perhaps a bit younger. Once I was happy with the gnome, as you can see, I kind of continued my process with the owls themselves, and the owls were very fun to paint. It was a bit of a challenge to figure out what I liked for the texture, specifically of the feathers, since obviously the owlbears are for the most, you know, covered in feathers. And the main process was not too complicated in the end. It's just a lot of hue variation between the different feathers, depending on the inclination basically of the plane. So if the plane was turned towards the sky a bit more, I might have added a bit more of a cold blue hue. If it was turned to the floor, then I might have warmed it up, because, you know, the warm brown would reflect light onto the bottom of the creatures themselves. And aside from that, the main thing that gives this texture isn't necessarily the texture of the material itself, it's actually the gaps in between each feathers. So the dark spots between the feathers, I think that's the most crucial thing when you're thinking about adding texture to something like hair, feathers, foliage, anything that's organic and comes in clumps. The gaps between the clumps is what you want to focus on, not necessarily the clumps themselves. The clumps themselves you can leave as just simple flat colors. The gaps in between is what separates the clumps and make sure that we have a very readable texture to it. And the same principle is applied to the hair of the character and the foliage of the environment as well. At this point in the process, I wasn't really sure where I wanted to take things. I was kind of avoiding the left side of the canvas because I didn't want to spend too much time on the environment itself. The character and the creatures obviously were more important, but at the same time, I did want things to feel complete. So I thought to myself, what can I do? Well, we have this dappled light scenario, and I can use that to my advantage to maybe frame the character and the creatures a little bit more clearly as well. So having those bright green spots behind the character on the environment in the far background, I think works quite well, kind of tying everything together. That way it doesn't feel like there's just a spotlight on the character center stage, but it feels like a lighting scenario that is consistent throughout the entire environment that is provided. Plus it also helps kind of make the scene feel like it is larger than the canvas, which is always a good thing. So you can see how that light really does help kind of separating perhaps the little owlbear, for example, from the background a bit more. And you're going to see that I'm going to do this more with the big owlbear as well a little bit later down the line, because we can use those big value contrasts between foreground and background elements to really emphasize the composition, to make sure that we have enough readability of certain parts of our silhouette of our creatures, so we actually know what's going on. And it's those groupings of values that really determine how successful a painting is going to look in the end. So you want to make sure that that is definitely something to keep in mind. The difficult thing now is, because I usually don't really render up paintings that much, I usually keep them fairly simple and rough because I don't like spending too long on a painting, is like, okay, where do I go from this point on? So again, I'm just kind of slowly making my way through the areas I've been avoiding so far. I've decided, yeah, I should probably just commit. I can't keep avoiding this. I can't keep noodling on things that already look decent. I actually need to tackle the things that haven't gotten the same treatment yet. And I think that's a personal problem for me, where I kind of lose interest in my painting if I'm taking too long painting it up. So I need to find a way for myself to keep it interesting. And you'll see that in a second. I'll probably use a couple cheats, in quotation marks, right, to add a little bit more texture in other areas that I haven't painted up. So you can see that the light behind the front paw of the owl, for example, does a good job getting that silhouette across, adding a bit of texture without having added texture, because it's just the light poking through the dark that is providing me with that grass texture. So I don't necessarily have to go overly complex in that case. And then after some time you'll see me grab specific parts of my painting, duplicate them, put them somewhere else to kind of use the textures I've already brushed in other parts, and use them for the non-textured parts. And the thing, the trick there is we want to make sure that we are actually adjusting the things that we are copying. You don't take something from somewhere, put it in, and expect it to work. You still need to work it into the painting to actually make sure that it does work. And right now that's exactly what you can see me do, just kind of using what I already have. It also keeps the colors consistent, which is a nice added benefit. And I think at this point I'm pretty much at a point where I'm pretty happy with the overall end result. Some things still feel a little bit messy, but like what I said earlier, you do need to figure out for yourself, like, how long do you want to spend on this? Is it worth maybe rendering up some parts in the background? Probably not so much. So personally, I'm probably just going to keep it as is right now, kind of adjusting the composition to make sure it works. And there was one thing that was missing, and I think the empty spot in front of the big owl was definitely causing me personally some issues with the composition as it was. So the simple thing is to add an even smaller owlbear cub, and once again, to avoid having to paint it all up, I'm just kind of using the textures that I've already put in there. Literally duplicated the head from the top one and just kind of warped it around, duplicated the leg from the bottom one, and painted over it, and just decided to turn that into a small extra character for the scene. And the fun thing is, without a lot of work, because it doesn't grab so much attention, it fits in quite nicely. and the end result works quite well. So I hope you guys enjoyed this scene as a whole. Like, I'm quite fond of the way it's looking. Once again, if you have more suggestions for what you'd like to see, let me know, and hopefully I'll catch you in the next video. Take care.